Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In this video, I'll be doing a full build and inbox review of Eduard's Weekend Edition 1/72nd scale FW190 A-5. If you want to see how I go about attempting a heavily weathered German temporary winter wash camouflage, and see how I think this kit compares to the Airfix and Tamiya 190 in this scale, then stick around. I start out as always by washing the sprues in some warm soapy water to clean any oil and residue from the moulds, and once dry I begin to cut out the cockpit floor, sidewall details, various cockpit panels, the seat, joystick and the front bulkhead. I used a knife to carefully remove any excess sprue from the parts, before then gluing the seat and joystick to the cockpit floor, followed by a centerpiece that goes on the floor, and two panels which attach to the rear bulkhead either side of the seat. While the glue bonded, I cut out the instrument panels, exhaust parts, and the various parts that make up the engine. I then used a file to sand away any imperfections, and fitted a spare polycap into the gearbox for the propeller before gluing that onto the engine detail. The fuselage halves, lower wing, two upper wing halves, wing spar, middle exhaust pipe and the landing gear parts were then cut out next, and once cleaned up I glued the wing spar to both of the upper wing halves and added the middle landing gear bay cover. I test fitted this with the lower wing to make sure the parts lined up, before then adding a small brace which goes in the middle, which I believe also contains some internal piping. Much like the Airfix kit, the cannons have to be installed before the wing top and bottom halves are joined, which puts them at risk of damage during the build, although these parts did fit well and were pretty solid. The rather fiddly centre exhaust pieces were then added to the lower wing, and what I believe is part of the machine gun system was attached to the upper wing assembly, and once the exhaust has been added to the fuselage halves and the front cockpit bulkhead was glued to the right fuselage, it was time to prime the interior. I mixed up some Vallejo acrylic gloss black primer and sprayed it on the two fuselage halves, the wing assemblies, cockpit assembly, the engine and the instrument panels. I then gave the primer 12 hours to cure before then spraying a light pass of Vallejo Model Air Insignia White, which was used to highlight the raised areas and details of these parts, before then adding their main colours. The inside of the landing gear bay was painted in a few light passes of Vallejo Model Air RLM2 Grey, and the entire cockpit assembly, fuselage sidewalls and instrument panels were painted with Vallejo Model Air RLM66 Dark Grey. The engine was painted with Vallejo Model Air Aluminium, and once all the colours had dried, I switched back to a brush for some of the finer details. Vallejo Model Colour Flat Yellow was used for the base of the throttle controls, Vallejo Model Colour Vermilion Red was then dry brushed on some of the raised cockpit details, and Vallejo Model Colour Flat Black was used for the details on the control column, some more of the raised side panel details, parts of the cannon barrels and wiring, and the gearbox of the engine. I painted the inside parts of the lower wing and engine cowling area, which might be just barely visible, with some Model Air RLM2 using a brush. Model Colour Flat White was also used for some extra cockpit raised details, and then I painted the barrels of the cannons with Vallejo Model Air Gunmetal Metallic. With the internal painting now done, I used a fine brush to dry brush some Tamiya XF16 flat aluminium along all the raised details, and especially around the wheel well and on the seat to create some metal chipping. To then make the metal chipping more subtle, I waited for the aluminium to dry, before then dry brushing a tiny bit of RLM66 on some of the larger chips around the cockpit, making them a bit smaller, and giving the paint a distressed look around the edges. This process was then repeated in the wheel well using some RLM2, and I also did another coat with it inside the engine cowling. After the RLM2 was dry, I then glued the upper and lower wing assemblies together using Revell Contactor Professional and some bulldog clips to hold them while the parts bonded. To highlight the details on all of these parts, as well as to add a tiny bit of a dirty and grimy effect, I then applied some Tamiya Black Panel Accent. I accidentally didn't record the full process, but this enamel wash flows into all of the recesses, making them darker, and since the paints I used are acrylic, I can then use some X20 enamel thinners to remove the excess panel liner, making the effect less dark and helping it to flow just into the gaps. Once the thinners and wash had dried, I then cut out the decals for the instrument panel and seat belts, soaked them in some water for a little under a minute, and then I slid them into place using a brush and gently pushed them into position using tweezers and a cocktail stick. Once in place, I then dabbed some Tamiya decal adhesive onto the decals to help them stick to the surface they're applied to. This kit features the option to use an instrument panel with raised details, which you can attempt to paint, but I decided to try the decals on the flat one instead. The clear film on the decals edges though is a little bit too large, so they're not exactly the best. Once the decals had sat for about 12 hours, I had to use my side cutters to remove the excess clear film from the edges of these parts, and once I'd done that, the lower instrument panel was glued to the cockpit tub assembly, and this was then glued to the left fuselage half. These parts fitted well, so I moved on to adding the top instrument panel, followed by the right fuselage. Once again, the fit of these parts was pretty good, and once I'd joined the parts together, I used some bulldog clips and some Tamiya masking tape to hold the parts together nice and tight. Before the fuselage halves bonded, I also glued the engine to the cowlings. While the fuselage halves bonded, I cut out the glare shield and cowling parts for the A-5 variant. The top part with the machine guns requires a fair bit of cleanup to remove the excess sprue and flash, and the front of the engine cowl also has a piece of plastic bar that needs to be removed from the middle. Finally, the front part of the top cowling was cut out and cleaned up, before I then removed the masking tape from the fuselage and glued the glare shield and cowling parts to the fuselage. The glare shield seemed to be too narrow to fit the cockpit sidewalls, but the cowling parts all fitted very nicely to the fuselage. By now the wing and fuselage halves were pretty much fully bonded, so I sanded any excess flash on the lower wing joints, and then glued them to the fuselage. The fit was a bit awkward, especially around the wing roots, and a fair bit of pressure and some extra glue was also required to get the front of the wing assembly to join to the cowling, but on the whole the fit was still pretty good. All of the controls except for the elevator come as separate parts, which I cut out at this stage, cleaned up, and then glued in neutral positions. The horizontal stabilizer parts were also joined once the rudder was in place. With the controls added, I'd assembled the model as far as I planned to before painting it, so I started to clean up the model using sandpaper to remove any remaining seam lines. Any panel lines that were weak or sanded over were rescored with a knife. The Eduard 190 has a lot of really lovely recessed details, including a lot of rivets, so I was really reluctant to use any putty and risk losing them. The kit did have a few very small gaps, especially around the wings and fuselage joints, but I decided to compromise and see how the model turned out without using any filler on them. As a result, once the sanding was completed, I cleaned off the model and then covered the cockpit, engine and wheel wells with some white tack to mask them off, and sprayed the entire model in several passes with some Vallejo acrylic gloss black primer until the model had a uniform gloss black finish. After the primer had been left to cure for 12 hours, I mixed up 3 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver, 3 drops of Vallejo acrylic thinners, and 3 drops of Vallejo Model Air aluminium, and began to spray it as a base coat over the entire model. To create a subtle pre-shading effect, I first sprayed the middle of each panel, leaving some of the black primer exposed along the panel lines and edges, and then I do a unifying pass over the entire model to blend it all together. I'd been experimenting with aluminium as a base for the paints, and quite liked the results I'd got from it, but I also originally planned to once again attempt using chipping fluid, so on this model I sprayed a thin coat of 6 drops of acrylic thinners mixed with 3 drops of Vallejo chipping fluid over the entire model. In the end, however, I wouldn't end up using the chipping technique, as I wasn't really happy with it on some other results for more subtle weathering. While the chipping fluid dried on the model, I masked off the main canopy using a combination of Tamiya masking tape for the sharp edges and some liquid mask to fill in the larger areas that are a bit more curved. This was then sprayed off camera with Vallejo Model Air RLM 66 to create the interior of its framework colours. To create a strong pre-shading effect, I decided to spray some model colour flat black along all of the panel lines, and then do some very light random patterns with it over the centre of various panels to create some variation in subsequent layers of paint. Though in the future I want to try post-shading the paint later instead of pre-shading, as I found my attempts with pre-shading tend to be a little bit too subtle for my liking. I might also experiment with some lighter colours as well as the black to get a little bit more variation. Once the pre-shading was completed, I moved on to adding the yellow markings. I like to add the yellow markings on Luftwaffe aircraft before painting the camouflage, so that there's no obvious lip or raised edges of the paint that would occur if I applied the yellow over the top of the camouflage. I masked off the areas where I'd be applying yellow to prevent any overspray which could cause discoloration with the later camouflage colours, and then I sprayed a few passes of Vallejo Model Air RLM4 yellow. Initially I used 1 drop of thinners, 3 drops of Vallejo Flow Improver, and 3 drops of paint, and did my best to keep the layers thin and transparent. It took a while however, and quite a few passes until the yellow was a solid colour. I also reckon the paint was a bit too thin initially as I experienced a lot of spiderwebbing, so I later added a few more drops of paint. I find yellow to be a very annoying colour to airbrush. Although I have heard using pink as a base colour can improve how easy it is to apply, I feel my results with several layers was still okay. Once I was satisfied with the yellow, I removed the masking tape from the edges and then added some over the top of all of the yellow to protect it from the camouflage layers I would be applying next. I started with the lightest colour first, which was for the underside. I mixed up 8 drops of Vallejo Acrylic Flow Improver, 6 drops of AK Interactive Acrylic Thinners, and 6 drops of AK Interactive RLM76 Variation 1 from the 3rd generation acrylics range. I applied this over the panels first once again, and then make unifying passes, just like as I did with the aluminium base layer. I've always preferred AK Interactive paints for German colours since they all use the RLM codes and seem to be a pretty good match, and I've found that they work just as well with the airbrush as they did when I was brush painting with them. Once I'm happy with the lighter colour and it had had a few hours to fully cure, I then mask off the underside using some Tamiya masking tape, which I like to stick on my arm first just to remove any tackiness before then putting it over the model. I also masked the edges of the horizontal stabilizers and tail to protect the tail area from the first of the camouflage colours. The scheme I chose was the one featured on the box art from Jägergeschwader 26 on the eastern front. This aircraft is a bit unusual in that it was painted in factory colours of RLM 74 and 75, but then in the field it had 70 and 71 sprayed over the top. On top of this, it also had a temporary white winter wash, which according to the instructions was starting to fade quite heavily. I only found one picture of the actual aircraft, so I had to largely go off of the instructions and box art for reference. I decided to start with the factory colours first, then apply the greens in a rougher fashion, and finally do the winter wash as part of the later on weathering process. So to paint the factory camouflage, I mixed up 6 drops of Flow Improver, 2 drops of the AK thinners, and 4 drops of the lighter AK Interactive RLM 75, mixed it up, and then sprayed it lightly following the camouflage pattern for the other 190 schemes included in the kit. I didn't bother masking any of the upper surface camouflage, as not only do I not really like masking, but the 190s all seem to have a reasonably soft edge to their camouflage, and this layer would also not be very visible with the final greens applied over the top of it. Once applied, acrylic paints dry pretty fast, so I moved on to applying the darker RLM 74 in the same fashion, pretty much straight away, and with a similar ratio of thinners to paint. Once I was satisfied with my lighter coat of the factory colours, I then mixed up 8 drops of Flow Improver, 6 drops of the AK acrylic thinners, and 5 drops of AK RLM 71, the lighter of the 2 green colours. After some test spraying, I ended up adding 4 more drops of paint to make it a little bit thicker, and once I'd mixed it up, I began to apply it onto the model following the marking guide. I tried to keep the paint nice and thin so that the darker greys would show through, and in some areas I also added a few more layers in patchy spots to give it a very rough field paint job kind of look. I also left some of the grey exposed near the wing roundel and wingtips based on the instructions. Once I was happy with the light green, I moved on to the darker green, which would be RLM 70. For this paint, I decided to mix up 10 drops of acrylic Flow Improver with 5 drops of the RLM 70, and skip adding the thinners to see if the thicker mix would help me achieve some sharper edges for the camouflage pattern. Following the marking guide, I sprayed it in the same manner as with the 71, leaving softer areas and adding a few larger models on the tail. I found that the Flow Improver already thinned the paint quite adequately, and it stopped me from having tip drying as much with the airbrush. After I'd applied the RLM 70, I was really happy with how everything looked, so I ended up removing all of the masking tape and spraying the entire model with a few light coats of Vallejo acrylic gloss varnish. This would seal the paint job from getting scratched or otherwise damaged, and also provide a smooth glossy surface to apply decals to, which helps to prevent them from silvering. I gave the varnish 12 hours to fully cure, and then I began to cut out the decals I wanted from the marking sheet. I noticed the Eduard marking guide didn't show any of the common stencils on the aircraft. Looking at references of other 190s that had been done up in non-standard paint schemes in the field, most of them still seem to have a lot of their common markings, especially the fuel placards. I guess this would be at the unit's discretion, but I decided to apply only some of the markings, including the fuel ones, and keep any stencils that would have been applied on the RLM 76 areas, since these would not have been overpainted. To apply the decals, I stick them in some warm distilled water, and once the decals start to lift off the paper, I slide them onto the model using my brush or a finger. There's a fair bit of clear film on the number 5 decal, but otherwise it wasn't too bad, and fortunately all of the decals went on with no issues. Once all the decals are in place, I apply my usual combo of Vallejo decal softener, using a cotton bud to gently rub it onto all of the decals, and follow this up with some Tamiya decal adhesive. This will help to soften the decals so that they show the surface details of the model, and the adhesive will then help them to stick to any complex shapes and surfaces, which I found very effective on this kit, which has a lot of rivet and recess details. I then left the decals to settle for around about 12 hours, and then I applied a few light coats of Vallejo's acrylic matte varnish over the entire model. This would protect the decals from the upcoming winter wash and weathering process, and it would also help blend them together with the camouflage colours, making them all look like they were painted on. Moving on to adding the winter camouflage, I wanted to attempt a heavily worn temporary winter wash look, so I decided to once again try Vallejo chipping fluid in a build. I mixed up 4 drops of flow improver with 3 drops of Vallejo chipping fluid and 2 drops of Vallejo acrylic thinners, and applied it over the entire model as a base coat. Instead of leaving it for 12 hours though, as I'd done with my Buffalo and Airfix 190, I instead straight away applied the winter camo using Vallejo model color flat white, building it up in thin layers following the marking guide. I aimed to give it a very blotchy and faded effect, as the instructions suggested it was beginning to fade. After a few minutes, I applied some water over select parts of the white camouflage to reactivate the chipping fluid, and then I created some chips to the winter wash by dabbing and wiping away the paint. Unfortunately though, I accidentally made a few chips that were too heavy or in areas I did not want them, and I decided to attempt to brush paint them with the white to fix them up. Unfortunately though, this turned into a real mess, especially on one of the wings. Luckily though, I was able to simply reactivate all of the chipping fluid and remove most of the white paint I'd messily brush painted on. After a few more chips and lighter scratches had been created, I then sprayed over some of the areas I'd messed up with model color flat white and did a few more touch-ups. Overall, I was quite happy with the effect I created, though next time I will definitely not try using a brush to fix any mistakes and end up causing more mess. Satisfied with the winter camouflage, I then used a fine brush to paint the trim tabs on the control surfaces with vermilion red. I would need to seal the white camo in with a matte varnish so that the chipping fluid couldn't later be reactivated, but before I did this, I cut out, cleaned up and assembled the landing gear struts and doors, along with the propeller assembly. I also cut out the wheels, but decided to paint them separately from the landing gear before gluing them in place to make things easier. All of these smaller parts received a coat of Vallejo Gloss Black acrylic primer to prepare them for paint, and then I painted them using various colours. The inside of the landing gear doors was sprayed with Vallejo Model Air RLM2 Grey, the hub of the propeller spinner was sprayed with Vallejo Model Air RLM4 Yellow, which took several coats due to the nature of yellow paint, and then I glued the tail wheel, main landing gear struts, and landing gear doors to the aircraft, along with the smaller parts such as the cannon barrels, pitot tubes, and antennas. I switched back once again to a brush and painted another coat of RLM2 Grey on the undercarriage, and painted the blades on the engine cooling fan and the wheels flat black, the pilot's headrest with Vallejo Model Air RLM66 Dark Grey, the propeller blades with AK Interactive RLM70, and the undersides of the antennas and outside of the landing gear doors with AK Interactive RLM76 Variation 1 to match the underside of the fuselage. After a few coats of these various colours and some finer details had been painted, such as the red markings on the stepladder and the black trim of the tyre on the tail wheel, I sealed the paint on these finer parts and the winter wash with a few passes of Vallejo matte varnish. I let the varnish dry for 12 hours before then moving on to some chipping. I dipped a fine brush in a small amount of Vallejo Model Air aluminium, and once the paint on the brush had been dabbed off on a paper towel, leaving only a small amount left, I then dry brushed it onto some of the areas that are most prone to chipping, which can be seen in reference photos. These include the wheel hubs, very lightly around the walkway areas, on the sliding parts of the canopy, around maintenance hatches, and also on the undercarriage and edges of the propeller blades. To reduce how much aluminium chipping is present on the propeller blades, I then applied some RLM70 over some of the larger chips, and then I mixed it with some model colour flat white, and dabbed that lightly around the chipping on the wings, and over some of the white on the engine cowling to create some damage to the white camouflage, and also some lighter superficial scratches on the aircraft that haven't fully removed its paint. This process was then repeated with white and RLM71, and on the underside of the aircraft with white and RLM76 variation 1. The propeller spinner received some touch-ups with model colour flat yellow, and once the chipping was dry, I then glued the wheel hubs to the landing gear strut, followed by the tyres and then the outer wheel hub. The cannon and machine gun barrels, along with the exhaust shrouds on the fuselage, were picked out with Vallejo Model Air Gunmetal Metallic, and the nav lights on the wingtips and unpainted parts of the landing gear struts and tail wheel hub were painted with a tiny bit of Vallejo Model Air RLM1 silver. At this stage, I removed the canopy and masking from the fuselage and the windows. Like with the Tamiya kit, I left the liquid mask on for way too long, so after I'd neatened up any mistakes by carefully scratching off any excess acrylic paint with a cocktail stick, I gave both sides of the main and front canopy a coat of Deluxe Materials Looks Like Glass to help remove some of the imperfections and improve their quality. While it didn't remove all of the marks, it still made them a lot more transparent and shiny. I set the canopies aside to dry for 24 hours, and fixed up some damage to the instrument panel before moving on to some more weathering. I plan to use some of the white and engine grime oil paints from Abteilung 502's range, but these oil paints work best if you let the excess oil seep out of them and onto some cardboard for a few hours before applying them, so I prepared some for later and did a few other touch-ups. These included painting the glare shield and gun sight with flat black, along with some touch-ups to the tyres, and to fix up the decals on the headrest and the seat belts, which were a bit glossy, I applied some matte varnish over the top of them. There was also a few marks on the rear canopy area I had to paint over with some RLM66, and once that was done, I then got out some black panel accent to do some panel highlighting. Since a lot of the aircraft was white, I decided to tone down the black wash by mixing in a small amount of Tamiya XF1 flat white enamel paint. Once the wash and white had been mixed and I'd added a little bit more enamel thinner, I mixed it up and then applied it over all of the recessed panels in the white areas of the model. This wash would flow into all of the gaps, helping to highlight all the kit's fantastic rivet and panel line details, and also add a bit more grime. On the underside of the aircraft, I switched to a dark brown panel wash for variety and to create a more dirty appearance, while for the darker areas on the upper surface and to add some oil and engine grime and grease in certain areas, I applied some black panel scent instead, especially around the engine cowling, on the access hatches, the landing gear, and the exhaust shrouds. I let the washes dry up, which only takes a few minutes, and then I use a cotton bud to drag some Tamiya X20 enamel wash over the entire model. The enamel thinners remove the excess panel wash from flat areas, helping to tone down the effect, and by dragging the wash in the direction air flows over the aircraft, it is also great for creating some streaking effects. I continued removing the excess panel liner with the thinner and creating streaks until I was happy with the effect. Next, I used some Tamiya XF1 flat black enamel paint to add some darker exhaust stains to the exhaust area, along with some oil stains and leaks from the radial engine, some gun smoke on the barrels and around the ejector ports, grease marks around the control hinges, and some extra leaks around the landing gear parts. To do this, I first dabbed a small amount of the paint on, and then I used a fine brush dipped in the enamel thinners and dragged the paint backwards. By now the oil paint was ready to be used, so I mixed some of the engine grime with AK Interactive's odorless thinners and applied it to create some exhaust stains. To soften the edges and drag the oil paint backwards, I then dipped the brush in odourless thinners and dabbed it to create some softer marks or pulled it to make some streaks. The white oil paint was applied as well, mainly on the wheels for a subtle build-up of snow in the treads, and to add some subtle white burn marks and stains in the exhaust area. After I'd applied the oil paints, I also dabbed some more of the flat black onto the gun barrels for some gun smoke, and once again used thinners to help soften the effect. For some additional build-up of snow, I used Vallejo Environmental Snow Effects. I used a fine brush to dab this acrylic paste onto some parts of the wheels, trying to follow reference photos for the positioning of the additional snow build-up. With the weathering now completed, I returned to finishing up the canopy area by painting the trim on the glare shield and gun sight with Vallejo Saddle Brown, and then dry brushing pale brown onto the glare shield for a faded leather look, before doing some touch-ups with flat black. I was building the Airfix and Tamiya kits of the 190 at a very similar time, and not only did I manage to mix up the headrest, which I talked about in my Tamiya 190 video, but it turns out I also mixed up the front canopy segments. I had to take off the Eduard canopy from the Tamiya 190 kit, and after putting it on this 190 I found it fit perfectly. To make life easier, I decided to remove the glare shield part and then glue the canopy into place using some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue, which forms a strong bond and doesn't fog up the clear parts. The gun sight was then glued to the glare shield, which was a very fiddly step, but once done I could then slide the glare shield back into place. The rocket glue was then used to glue the headrest to the canopy area, and then I placed the canopy into position but didn't glue it so that I could still access the cockpit if required. To finish up the nav lights, I applied some X26 clear green over the silver on the right side of the wing, and used X27 clear red for the left side. The final detail to add was the antenna wiring, which was done using some AK Interactive Mega Thin rigging wire and regular fast-acting CA glue. I found it was a lot easier to glue the antenna to the tail and the smaller line to the rear fuselage, but I have noticed it takes a little while for the superglue to stick any canopy parts if I've treated them with the looks like glass, but nevertheless, after much fiddling and swearing, I eventually got the wires attached, and with that, my build of the Eduard 190 A-5 was finally completed. And here you can see the finished build. So how did I find Eduard's FW190 A-5? Well, there were a few negatives. The most noticeable for me was the main instrument panel. The included decals have far too much clear film, which makes them really tricky to trim and apply neatly, and the raised details are also a little bit poor, especially when compared to the Tamiya kit on its instrument panel. The assembly order for the glare shield was also another issue, with the instructions suggesting adding it after joining the fuselage halves, but I found it was much easier in the end to leave it off until after I'd fitted the canopy, and then carefully slide it into place afterwards. The overall assembly is definitely more complex than other 190s, but thankfully the fit is generally very good. There were still a few small gaps, and I really should have taken the time to fill them in. My excuse is that I really didn't want to risk damaging the beautiful surface detail and rivets on this kit. I have since been suggested to try using water-based putty and wiping it away before it dries to help preserve those details, which is definitely something I'll do for next time. Having said all that, I still absolutely loved this kit. The detail was superb, and the range of marking options is fantastic. It was really hard to choose just one scheme, but in the end I went with the box art option, a rather rough looking winter scheme from the eastern front since I quite liked the look of it. I've also been wanting to do some more weathered battle-worn finishes like this one, and it fitted quite perfectly in with my other collections. There are also some western front and another unique eastern front option in the box, so you're really spoiled for choice, and I could easily be tempted to do another one in the future. So is this the best 190 kit in 1/72nd scale? I'd have to say yes, unless you're a beginner looking for something simpler, or you specifically want a later D model with the inline engine, or the short-nosed early variants like Tamiya's A3. This kit offers far better detail than the equivalent Airfix, Revell or Academy versions, a great selection of markings, a huge range of variants to choose from, and Eduard also offer more detailed Profi Pack editions with photo etching and some other aftermarket parts for experienced modelers who love finer detail. Overall, this is a fantastic kit from Eduard, easily my favourite FW190 A series in 1/72nd scale so far, and I'm very much looking forward to applying what I've learnt here when I tackle their A8, and also their BF109 G5 and G6 kits when I do them in future videos. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also consider subscribing to the channel as it really helps out. And if you want to help fund my inbox reviews, builds, and also my stop motions, then please consider joining my Patreon. A massive thank you to all my current patrons for helping me to fund making these kits and doing these videos. Next week I should have part 1 for my Italeri P51A Mustang coming out, so stay tuned for that one. And at the moment I'm currently working on the next War Thunder stop motion, quite a fair few other builds and some 3D printing projects, and I've just started a new job, so I may be a little bit slower with releasing at some points during the next few weeks, but we'll see how things go. Otherwise though, thanks again for watching, and until the next video, as always, take care and model on.